Every father knows the sound of his child's laughter echoing through the house, and every father dreads the silence that follows when that laughter is suddenly gone forever. Jacob McCallister had been both blessed and cursed with that knowledge. On a cold morning in 1880s Colorado, when Outlaws took his 8-year-old daughter Sarah, Jacob was no ordinary man. He was a mountain man who could track footprints through solid rock and survive in places that would kill most folks in a day. For 15 years, he had lived quietly with Sarah in their cabin, teaching her about the wilderness after her mother died. But when the Blackwood gang rode off with his little girl, they woke up something dangerous. Jacob took his rifle and began a 40-day hunt across the harshest country in the West. What he found at the end would change everything he thought he knew about his own family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine trees like a gentle blessing, as Jacob McCallister stepped onto the wooden porch of his cabin, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. The larger mug was his, thick ceramic, chipped from years of use, dark as the mountain soil. The smaller one was painted with tiny wildflowers, a gift he'd bought for Sarah's 7th birthday from a traveling merchant who'd admired her polite manners and bright smile. "Papa, look what I found," Sarah called from the edge of their clearing, her voice carrying that particular excitement children reserve for discoveries that adults might dismiss as ordinary. She held up a pine cone the size of her small fist, its scales perfectly arranged in nature's mathematical precision. Jacob set both cups on the porch rail and walked toward his daughter, his boots crunching softly on the frost-touched grass. At 8 years old, Sarah had her mother's auburn hair and questioning green eyes, but she'd inherited Jacob's steady hands and natural curiosity about the world around them. In the 3 years since Mary's passing, Jacob had watched his daughter grow from a grieving child into a remarkable young person who could identify animal tracks, predict weather changes, and move through the forest with an awareness that impressed even seasoned woodsmen. "That's a sugar pine cone," Jacob said, kneeling beside her to examine her discovery. "See how the scales curve outward? The Washoe people used to gather the nuts from these. They're sweet and full of good fat for winter." Sarah turned the cone, in her hands, studying its structure with the same intensity she brought to everything Jacob taught her. This was their morning ritual: coffee for him, warm milk with honey for her, and whatever lessons the wilderness offered up each day. Jacob had learned that children absorbed knowledge best when it came naturally, woven into daily life rather than forced upon them like medicine. Their cabin sat in a natural meadow, surrounded by towering pines and protected by granite outcroppings that formed a bowl around their small piece of paradise. Jacob had chosen this spot carefully 15 years ago when he'd first retreated. From civilization, seeking solitude after experiences he rarely discussed. The location provided fresh water from a year-round spring, southern exposure for Sarah's vegetable garden, and enough isolation to ensure their privacy while remaining accessible to the occasional trader or friendly neighbor. Jacob pulled his survival journal from his shirt pocket, a leather-bound book he'd carried for over 2 decades, its pages filled with sketches of animal tracks, weather patterns, edible plants, and medicinal herbs. He'd started it during his younger years, when survival knowledge meant the difference between life and death in situations he no longer spoke about. Now it served a gentler purpose, helping him pass essential wilderness skills to his daughter. "Come here, little one," he said, settling cross-legged on a fallen log. "Let me show you something about these cones." Sarah nestled beside him as Jacob opened the journal to a page covered with detailed drawings of various pine cones, each labeled with notes about their characteristics, harvest seasons, and uses. His handwriting was careful and precise, the work of a man who understood that information might need to be read in poor light or desperate circumstances. "Your mama helped me draw some of these," Jacob said softly, running his finger along a particularly detailed sketch. "She had a gift for seeing the small things that mattered most." Mary had been gone for 3 years, claimed by a fever that no amount of wilderness medicine could cure. Jacob had ridden hard to fetch the doctor from Gold Creek, but the storm that delayed him had cost precious hours. He still wondered sometimes if those hours might have made the difference, though Sarah's practical nature, so much like her mother's, helped keep his guilt from consuming him entirely. "I remember her hands," Sarah said, tracing the same drawing with her small finger. "They were always warm, even in winter." Jacob felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied memories of his late wife. But Sarah's presence transformed grief into something bearable. The child had an unusual capacity for accepting life's hardships without losing her fundamental joy, a resilience that both amazed and worried him. He wanted to protect that strength while ensuring she understood the world's genuine dangers. "She would have been proud of how well you've learned to read the forest," Jacob said. "Yesterday you spotted that deer trail I almost missed. Your eyes are getting sharper every season." Sarah beamed at the praise, then grew thoughtful. "Papa, why do you know so much about surviving? Before Mama died, you used to disappear sometimes. Where did you go?" Jacob closed the journal, considering his words carefully. Sarah deserved honesty, but she was still a child. Some truths could wait until she was older and better equipped to understand the complexities of adult choices and consequences. "Before I came to these mountains, I lived a different kind of life," he said. "I learned things that helped me stay alive in difficult places, far from home. When I met your mother, I realized I wanted something better than just surviving. I wanted to build something peaceful and lasting. Like our cabin, like our family," Jacob corrected gently. "The cabin is just wood and stone. Family is what makes a place feel like home." They walked back toward the cabin together, Sarah chattering about her plans for the day, while Jacob's mind wandered to practical concerns. Winter would arrive in a few months, and he needed to finish splitting firewood, check their food stores, and make sure their shelter could withstand another harsh Colorado winter. These mountains tested everyone who chose to call them home, but Jacob had learned to read their moods and work with their rhythms rather than fighting against them. The morning routine continued with breakfast: fresh trout from the stream, eggs from their small flock of chickens, and bread Sarah had helped bake the previous evening. Jacob watched his daughter eat with the healthy appetite of a growing child, noting how she'd learned to savor her food rather than rushing through meals. Mountain life taught patience and appreciation for simple pleasures. "After we finish eating, I want to show you how to repair snares," Jacob said. "The rabbits have been getting cleverer about avoiding our usual spots." Sarah nodded eagerly. She approached every lesson with enthusiasm, understanding instinctively that knowledge might someday mean survival. Jacob had never explicitly told her that wilderness skills could be matters of life and death, but children possessed their own wisdom about such things. As they cleaned up after breakfast, Jacob found himself studying Sarah's face, memorizing the way morning light brought out the gold flecks in her green eyes. These quiet moments had become precious to him, the gentle rhythm of their shared life, the way she trusted his guidance completely, the gradual transformation of a grieving widower into someone who could imagine happiness again. He had no way of knowing that this would be their last peaceful morning together, that by tomorrow the cabin would stand empty, and Sarah's laughter would be replaced by a silence that would drive him across hundreds of miles of unforgiving wilderness. For now, Jacob McCallister was simply a father teaching his daughter about pine cones and planning their day around the gentle rhythms of mountain life. "Papa," Sarah said, looking up from washing their breakfast dishes in a basin of warm water, "do you think Mama can see us from heaven?" Jacob paused in his task of banking the fire, struck by the question's timing and his daughter's serious expression. "I believe she watches over us," he said carefully, "and I think she'd be proud of the strong, smart young woman you're becoming." Sarah smiled, satisfied with his answer, and returned to her chores with renewed energy. Jacob watched her work, noting how she'd learned to be thorough without being wasteful, efficient without hurrying. These were lessons that extended far beyond housekeeping. principles of living that would serve her well, no matter what challenges life presented. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and promising another beautiful day in their mountain sanctuary. Jacob felt a deep contentment settling over him like a comfortable old coat. This was the life he'd dreamed of during those harder years. Simple, peaceful, and filled with love. He had everything a man could reasonably want. Tomorrow he would learn how quickly everything could be taken away. The sound came at dawn, hoofbeats thundering across the meadow like a violent heartbeat against the mountain silence. Jacob's eyes snapped open in his narrow bed, every instinct from his forgotten years screaming danger. He'd learned long ago to trust the part of his mind that never truly slept. The sentinel that catalogued every unusual sound and movement even in dreams. Sarah was already stirring in her small room across the cabin's main living area, her sharp ears having caught the same ominous rhythm. Jacob slipped from bed and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the heavy curtains he'd sewn from deer hide. What he saw made his blood run cold. 6 riders approached at full gallop, their horses lathered with sweat and foam. Even at a distance, Jacob could see these weren't ordinary travelers. They rode with the loose, predatory grace of men accustomed to taking what they wanted through force. Their leader, a tall man with a black beard and a long coat that flapped behind him like a vulture's wings, gestured toward the cabin with movements that spoke of command and violence. "Sarah," Jacob called quietly, his voice carrying the controlled urgency she'd learned to recognize and obey without question. "Come here, quickly." His daughter appeared at his side, her nightgown white as moonlight, her hair tousled from sleep. When she saw his expression, her face grew serious. Sarah had inherited more than her mother's looks. She possessed an intuitive understanding of when situations had turned dangerous. "Bad men?" she whispered. Jacob nodded grimly. "Get dressed, quickly and quietly. Then go to the root cellar and hide behind the potato sacks like we practiced." They'd never actually practiced such a thing, but Sarah was intelligent enough to understand that some lies were meant to protect. She disappeared into her room, while Jacob grabbed his Winchester rifle from its place above the fireplace. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the action and loading fresh cartridges into the magazine. The familiar weight of the weapon brought back memories he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. The riders had reached their front yard. Jacob could hear their horses snorting and stamping, leather creaking as the men dismounted. Through the window, he watched the bearded leader survey their small homestead with calculating eyes, taking inventory of everything that might have value. When those eyes settled on the cabin itself, Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. A heavy fist pounded on the door, rattling the frame Jacob had built with his own hands. "Open up!" The voice carried authority and cruelty in equal measure. "We know someone's in there." Jacob moved to the door but didn't open it. "State your business," he called through the thick wood. "This is private property." Harsh laughter answered him. "Private property," the leader repeated, his voice dripping mockery. "You hear that, boys? The mountain man thinks he owns this place." More laughter, uglier now. Jacob counted voices. Definitely 6 men, probably armed, certainly dangerous. Through a crack in the doorframe, he could see gun belts and the glint of metal. His mind began calculating angles and distances, cover positions and escape routes. Old skills rose to the surface like scars that never fully healed. "We're looking for supplies," the leader continued. "Food, ammunition, anything useful. You can make this easy or you can make it hard, but either way, we're coming in." Jacob's grip tightened on his rifle. "I've got nothing you need. Keep riding." "Oh, but you're wrong about that." The voice moved closer to the door, and Jacob could hear the smile in it. "See, we've been watching your place for a while. You and that pretty little daughter of yours live real comfortable up here. Real isolated, too. Nobody around to hear if things get loud." Ice formed in Jacob's veins. They'd been watching Sarah. These weren't random bandits. They'd scouted his home, learned his routines, planned this raid. The realization transformed his fear into something colder and more dangerous. "My daughter's not here," Jacob lied. "She's visiting her aunt in Denver." Now why would you say something like that when we can see her little footprints in the frost right outside this door? The leader's voice had taken on a patient, almost conversational tone that somehow made it more frightening. Fresh ones, too. Made this morning when she went to feed those chickens, Jacob cursed silently. Sarah's morning routine had betrayed them. He'd taught her to be observant and careful, but 8-year-old children couldn't be expected to think like hunted animals. That was a parent's job. Last chance, mountain man. Open the door. Jacob made his decision. In one fluid motion, he threw back the heavy wooden bar that secured the door and yanked it open, bringing the Winchester to his shoulder in the same movement. The leader stood directly in front of him, close enough that Jacob could see the amusement in his dark eyes. "There he is," the man said pleasantly. Jacob McCallister, the famous ghost of the high country. The use of his name stopped Jacob cold. These men knew who he was. Not just his current identity as a peaceful mountain man, but something deeper, something from before. "That's right," the leader continued, noting Jacob's shock. "We know all about you. Your real name, your real history, and most importantly, what you're worth to certain interested parties." "I don't know what you're talking about," Jacob said, but his voice lacked conviction. The past he'd tried to bury was rising from its grave. "Sure you don't." The leader's smile never wavered. "Tell me, do you still have nightmares about Antietam Creek? Or maybe Chancellorsville? All those boys who didn't make it home because of decisions you made?" The names hit Jacob like physical blows. Battles from a war he'd tried to forget. Places where he'd earned a reputation that followed him even into these remote mountains. He'd been a different man then. Harder, colder, willing to make choices that haunted his sleep even now. "That was a long time ago," Jacob said quietly. "Not so long that people have forgotten. There's still money on your head, McCallister. Still folks who'd pay handsomely to settle old scores." The leader gestured to his men, who began spreading out in a semicircle around the cabin door. "Lucky for you, we're not bounty hunters. We're businessmen with simpler needs. What do you want?" "Like I said, supplies, provisions, anything valuable." The leader's eyes flicked toward the cabin's interior, searching for movement. "And maybe a little insurance to make sure you don't cause us trouble down the road." "Insurance?" The leader's smile turned predatory. "That pretty daughter of yours. She comes with us. Good behavior on your part, and maybe we bring her back in a few weeks." "Bad behavior?" He shrugged eloquently. Jacob's world went red around the edges. Every instinct screamed at him to raise the rifle and start shooting. Consequences be damned. 6 men were too many. The angle's all wrong. But fury made strategy difficult to maintain. "She's just a child," Jacob said through clenched teeth. "Children grow up fast on the frontier," the leader replied. "Besides, we'll take good care of her. Won't we, boys?" The casual evil in those words snapped something inside Jacob. He began to raise the Winchester, knowing it was hopeless but unable to stop himself. The leader's hand moved toward his pistol with practiced speed. That's when Sarah appeared in the doorway behind Jacob. "Papa?" she said in a small voice. "What's happening?" Every man in the yard went still. Sarah stood framed in the doorway like something from a painting, small, innocent, beautiful, in the way that made grown men remember they'd once been children too. Her green eyes took in the scene with disturbing clarity, understanding more than any 8-year-old should have to. "There she is," the leader breathed. "Even prettier than we heard." Jacob felt his daughter's hand slip into his, small fingers gripping tight. The touch steadied him, reminded him that rage without strategy would only get them both killed. He needed to think, to plan, to find a way out of this that didn't end with Sarah in the hands of monsters. "Run, Sarah," he said quietly. "Go to the cellar like I told you," but it was too late. 2 of the bandits had already circled behind the cabin. Jacob heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath as she spotted them through the rear window. They were trapped, caught in their own home like animals in a snare. "No running," the leader said cheerfully. "No hiding. Just a simple transaction between reasonable men." He gestured towards Sarah with mock courtesy. "Young lady, would you be so kind as to step outside? We have a long ride ahead of us." Sarah's grip on Jacob's hand tightened to the point of pain. "I don't want to go," she whispered. You don't have to, Jacob told her, though he knew it was a lie. Nobody's taking you anywhere, the leader laughed. Oh, but they are. See, this is bigger than just you and me, McCallister. There are people who want to have a conversation with you about old times, old debts. Your daughter is going to make sure that conversation happens on their terms, not yours. Jacob's mind raced through possibilities and found them all hopeless. 6 armed men, 1 child to protect, no cover, no help coming. The mathematics of violence had always been his specialty, and right now they added up to defeat. 40 days, the leader said, his voice taking on a more businesslike tone. Follow our trail, catch up to us, and maybe we can work something out. Don't follow or bring the law, and you'll never see her again. Please, Jacob said, the word torn from somewhere deep in his chest. Take me instead. Oh, we will, eventually. But first you're going to spend some time thinking about all those boys who died because of your orders. All those families that never got their sons back home. The leader's eyes held old hatred now, personal and burning. 40 days of wondering if your little girl is scared, hungry, crying for her papa. 40 days to understand what it feels like to lose someone you love. Sarah stepped closer to Jacob, her small body trembling but her voice steady. I'm not afraid, she said, looking directly at the leader. My papa taught me how to be brave. The simple dignity of those words hit Jacob harder than any blow. His 8-year-old daughter was trying to protect him, to show strength in the face of terror, because he'd taught her that courage mattered more than fear. Brave indeed, the leader said softly. She'll need that where she's going. He nodded to his men. Jacob raised the Winchester, knowing it was futile, but unable to do nothing. Before he could fire, something struck him from behind, the butt of a rifle wielded by one of the bandits who'd flanked their cabin. Pain exploded through his skull and his knees buckled. Through a haze of stars and nausea, he heard Sarah scream. Rough hands seized her, lifting her struggling form onto a horse. Jacob tried to rise, tried to reach for her, but his vision kept sliding in and out of focus. 40 days, the leader called as the bandits mounted up. Don't disappoint us, McCallister. That little girl's life depends on you remembering how to be the man you used to be. The hoofbeats faded into distance, taking Sarah's cries with them. Jacob knelt in his doorway, blood running from his scalp, staring at the empty meadow where his daughter had vanished. On the ground near his feet, caught on a thorn bush, fluttered a small piece of blue calico fabric, a fragment torn from Sarah's nightgown. Jacob picked up the fabric with shaking fingers. It was soft, still warm from her body, and smelled faintly of the lavender soap Mary used to make. Such a small thing, but it proved Sarah had been here, that this nightmare was real. He struggled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his head and the weakness in his legs. 40 days, the leader had said. 40 days to follow their trail across God knew how many miles of wilderness. 40 days to become the man he'd tried so hard to leave behind. Jacob looked at the scrap of fabric in his palm, then at the survival journal lying open on the cabin floor where it had fallen during the struggle. 2 artifacts of his life, one representing everything innocent and precious, the other containing knowledge that might be the difference between Sarah's life and death. The hunt was about to begin, the blood on Jacob's scalp had dried to a brown crust by the time he forced himself to move. The sun hung low in the morning sky, casting long shadows across the meadow that held the hoofprints of 6 horses and the scattered fragments of his former life. His head pounded with each heartbeat, but the pain helped focus his mind on what needed to be done. Jacob gathered supplies with methodical precision, his hands moving through tasks while his thoughts remained fixed on Sarah's frightened face. He rolled his sleeping blanket tight, filled his water skins from the spring, and packed jerky, hardtack, and coffee into a leather satchel that had seen him through countless miles in younger days. Every item had to earn its place. Weight meant fatigue, and fatigue could mean the difference between catching up to the Blackwood gang or losing Sarah forever. The Winchester went across his shoulders on its familiar leather sling. His Colt revolver rode in the holster at his hip, cleaned and loaded, the weight both comforting and ominous. Jacob hadn't worn a gun belt in 3 years, but his body remembered the balance, the way the weapon became part of his natural movement. Some skills never left a man, no matter how hard he tried to forget them. Before leaving the cabin, Jacob wrote a brief note and pinned it to the door. If anyone came looking, and someone eventually would, when he and Sarah failed to appear at the autumn trading post, they'd know what had happened. The words came hard, each one a small admission of failure. Sarah taken by Blackwood gang. Following their trail, if you find this and we haven't returned, tell Marshal Davies in Gold Creek. Jacob locked the cabin door and pocketed the key, though he doubted either he or Sarah would ever use it again. The home they'd built together felt fragile now, temporary, in a way he'd never noticed before. A man's sanctuary only lasted as long as the world allowed it to exist in peace. The trail left by 6 horses and riders was easy to follow at first. The gang had made no effort to hide their passage, confident in their head start and Jacob's supposed helplessness. Hoofprints cut deep into the soft earth near the stream, and broken branches marked their passage through the pine grove that bordered the meadow's eastern edge. Jacob knelt beside the clearest tracks, studying them with eyes that had once been legendary for their ability to read stories in disturbed earth. The lead horse, the one carrying the bearded man who'd spoken with such casual cruelty, had a distinctive chip in its left front shoe. One of the trailing horses favored its right rear leg slightly, probably an old injury that didn't cause lameness, but created an irregular gait pattern. These details would matter when the trail grew cold or confusion arose about which direction the gang had taken. The first miles led downhill through familiar territory. Jacob had hunted these slopes countless times with Sarah, teaching her to identify game trails and recognize the subtle signs that revealed an animal's passage. Now he applied those same skills to human prey, noting where horses had paused to drink, where riders had dismounted to adjust equipment, where someone had stopped to relieve himself against a pine tree. 3 hours into his pursuit, Jacob came across the first clear evidence that Sarah was indeed with the gang. Near a small clearing where the horses had rested, he found tiny footprints in a patch of damp earth, unmistakably hers, showing the distinctive wear pattern of the boots he'd made for her last winter. The prints were surrounded by larger boot marks, suggesting the riders had allowed her to dismount briefly. Whether from kindness or necessity, Jacob couldn't tell. The discovery brought both relief and renewed anguish. Sarah was alive and apparently able to walk, but she was also miles from home, in the company of dangerous men with unknown intentions. Jacob forced himself to examine the scene with professional detachment, gathering information that might prove useful later. One detail caught his attention. Sarah's footprints showed she'd walked a small circle around a particular boulder, as if examining something closely. Jacob searched the area and found what had drawn her interest: a patch of unusual wildflowers growing in the boulder's shadow. Sarah had always been fascinated by plants, especially ones she hadn't seen before. Even in her current circumstances, her curious nature was asserting itself. The thought of his daughter's intellectual courage in the face of terror filled Jacob with fierce pride and deeper worry. Sarah's inquisitive spirit was part of what made her special, but it might also put her in greater danger if her captors interpreted curiosity as defiance. Jacob continued following the trail as it wound through increasingly unfamiliar territory. The gang was heading generally southeast, away from the main wagon roads and established settlements. This suggested they had a specific destination in mind, rather than wandering randomly across the landscape. That knowledge might prove valuable. Men following a planned route were more predictable than those moving on impulse. As the afternoon wore on, Jacob found his pace settling into the rhythm he remembered from long-ago pursuits in very different circumstances. His legs found their stride, his breathing steadied, and his mind began cataloguing distance, terrain, and the countless small details that might matter later. The skills were rusty, but not gone, like a language he hadn't spoken in years, but could still understand when forced to use it. Near sunset, Jacob reached a rocky outcropping that offered a view of the valley below. The gang's trail continued down toward a creek that meandered between stands of aspen and cottonwood. In the distance, perhaps 2 miles ahead, he could see wisps of smoke that might indicate a campfire. His first instinct was to close the distance immediately, but experience counseled patience. Jacob settled behind a screen of boulders and studied the distant smoke through the small brass telescope he'd carried in his pack. The magnification revealed what appeared to be a well-used camping spot beside the creek, probably a place where travelers regularly stopped for water and rest. If the Blackwood gang was indeed camped there, approaching in daylight would be suicide. Better to wait for full darkness and scout their position carefully. While he waited, Jacob opened his survival journal and made careful notes about the day's discoveries. The chip in the lead horse's shoe, the injured animal's gait pattern, Sarah's apparent interest in unknown flowers, the gang's southeastern direction of travel. All potentially important information that he might need to recall weeks from now, when fatigue and stress had clouded his memory. The journal's familiar weight in his hands brought back memories of other pursuits, other camps where he'd sat alone in the darkness planning approaches that might mean life or death for himself and others. The techniques were the same, but the stakes felt infinitely higher. In his younger days, he'd been pursuing enemies, dangerous men who'd chosen their fate through their actions. Now he was hunting for his daughter, an innocent child whose only crime was being born to a father with a complicated past. As full darkness settled over the valley, Jacob crept closer to the suspected campsite. The terrain favored stealth, loose shale that absorbed footsteps, scattered boulders that provided cover, and a creek whose babbling masked small sounds. He moved with the deliberate care of a man who understood that one misstep could cost everything. The smoke he'd seen proved to come from a small fire built in the shelter of an overhanging rock. Around it, Jacob could make out the shapes of sleeping men wrapped in blankets, 5 figures instead of 6. One man sat with his back against a tree, apparently standing watch, a rifle across his knees, and his attention focused on the darkness beyond the fire's light. Jacob spent 20 minutes working his way around the camp's perimeter, noting positions, weapons, and possible escape routes. The horses were picketed near the creek, close enough to the fire for security, but far enough away that they wouldn't be spooked by sudden movements. The gang had chosen their position well, defensible, with good sight lines and multiple options if they needed to move quickly. But where was Sarah? Jacob's heart hammered as he searched the campsite for any sign of his daughter. The mathematics were wrong. 6 riders, but only 5 sleeping forms, and none small enough to be an 8-year-old child. Fear rose in his throat, cold and bitter. Had they already? Movement near the creek caught his eye. A 6th figure emerged from the trees, walking toward the fire, with the casual gait of someone answering nature's call. As the man came into the light, Jacob could see it was the bearded leader, stretching and yawning, like a man who'd been sleeping peacefully. Still, no sign of Sarah. Jacob forced himself to think logically. The gang wouldn't have killed her. She was too valuable as leverage over him. More likely, they'd hidden her somewhere secure, probably tied up to prevent escape attempts. The obvious place would be among the trees near the horses, close enough for supervision, but far enough from the fire to muffle any sounds she might make. Jacob began a careful circuit toward the horse lines, moving with infinite patience through the darkness. His feet found solid ground by feel. His body flowed around obstacles like water, and his breathing remained controlled despite the terror gnawing at his chest. These were skills learned in circumstances he preferred not to remember, polished by necessity and baptized in other people's blood. Near the horses, Jacob's persistence was rewarded. A small shelter had been constructed from blankets stretched between tree trunks, crude but effective protection from the night air. Inside, barely visible in the darkness, lay a motionless form too small to be anyone but Sarah. Jacob's relief was so intense it made him dizzy. She was there, apparently unharmed, probably sleeping. Every instinct screamed at him to rush forward, cut whatever bonds held her, and carry her away into the safety of darkness. But the rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through 2 wars, and countless dangerous situations forced him to wait and observe. The Kiai shelter was positioned where the camp's sentry could watch it easily. Any attempt to reach Sarah would require dealing with the guard first, and that meant violence, noise, and the attention of 5 other armed men. Even if Jacob succeeded in killing or disabling the sentry silently, extracting Sarah from the camp without waking the others would be nearly impossible. The risk of getting her killed in the attempt was too high. Jacob spent another hour studying the camp, memorizing details, and looking for opportunities that didn't exist. Finally, with dawn approaching and the need to withdraw before daylight exposed him, he began the careful journey back to his own temporary shelter among the rocks above the valley. The night's reconnaissance had answered some questions and raised others. Sarah was alive and apparently unharmed, but she was also under close guard in a well-defended position. The Blackwood gang was experienced and professional, not the random criminals Jacob had initially hoped they might be. Rescuing Sarah would require more than stealth and determination. It would demand the full resurrection of skills Jacob had spent 15 years trying to bury. As he settled into his cold camp to wait for morning, Jacob pulled out a crumpled piece of paper he'd been carrying since leaving the cabin. It was a wanted poster, old and faded, bearing the image of a younger man with hard eyes and a description of crimes that made civilized people cross themselves in fear. Marcus Blackjack Blackwood, wanted for murder, kidnapping, robbery, and worse. The poster offered a substantial reward and warned that Blackwood should be considered extremely dangerous. At the bottom, in smaller print, it mentioned that Blackwood was believed to be seeking revenge against certain former military officers for unspecified grievances dating to the Civil War. Jacob stared at the poster until his eyes burned, finally understanding why the gang leader had known his name and history. This wasn't a random crime or even a simple kidnapping for profit. This was personal, rooted in events from decades past that Jacob had thought were buried, along with the men who died because of his decisions. Sarah had been taken not just as a daughter, but as a weapon in a war that should have ended at Appomattox. The realization made Jacob's blood run cold, because it meant Blackwood's intentions went far beyond ransom or leverage. This was about inflicting maximum pain, and an 8-year-old girl was the perfect instrument for that purpose. Jacob folded the poster carefully and tucked it back into his pocket. Tomorrow he would continue the pursuit, following a trail that led not just across hostile wilderness but back into the darkest chapters of his own history. The man who'd built a peaceful life in the mountains was gone now, burned away by necessity and a father's love. What remained was something harder and more dangerous, something Jacob had hoped never to become again. The hunt was just beginning. Dawn broke grey and cold over the valley, revealing terrain that looked different in daylight than it had during Jacob's nighttime reconnaissance. The Blackwood gang's campsite lay empty now, their fire reduced to scattered ashes and their presence marked only by trampled grass and horse droppings. They'd broken camp before sunrise, a professional touch that spoke of military experience and careful planning. Jacob studied the abandoned site through his telescope, noting details that darkness had hidden. The gang had been methodical in their departure, scattering evidence and obscuring their trail in ways that suggested this wasn't their first time evading pursuit. But they weren't perfect. No one ever was when they had to move quickly and manage a kidnapped child. The trail led southeast toward country Jacob had never seen before. High desert transitioning to badlands, where water became scarce and the sun turned landscape into a furnace during summer months. It was territory that would test every survival skill he possessed, and the gang had chosen it deliberately to discourage pursuit. Jacob packed his meager camp and began following the trail with renewed urgency. The gang had gained hours on him, and every mile between them made Sarah's rescue more difficult. But haste had to be balanced against caution. A turned ankle or missed water source could end the pursuit as surely as losing the trail entirely. 3 miles from the abandoned campsite, Jacob found the first sign that Sarah was still alive and thinking. Near a creek crossing where the horses had paused to drink, he discovered a small pile of smooth river stones arranged in a pattern he recognized. Sarah had learned the technique from an old Ute, medicine man who'd visited their cabin the previous winter, a way of marking direction using natural materials that looked random to casual observers. The stones pointed southeast, confirming the gang's general direction, but also proving that Sarah was alert enough to leave markers for him to find. The knowledge filled Jacob with pride and worry in equal measure. His daughter was showing remarkable courage and intelligence, but such behavior might anger her captors if they discovered what she was doing. Jacob carefully scattered the stones to prevent anyone else from reading their message, then continued following the main trail. The terrain grew more challenging as the day progressed. Loose shale that slid underfoot, rocky outcroppings that forced long detours, and an increasingly sparse water supply that required careful rationing of his reserves. By midday, the sun had turned the landscape into a shimmering hell. Jacob's shirt clung to his back with sweat, and his water skins felt lighter with each sip. This was desert country now, beautiful in its harsh way, but utterly unforgiving to those who made mistakes. The gang was testing him, seeing if a soft mountain man could survive in conditions that killed unprepared travelers. What they didn't know was that Jacob had crossed worse country under more difficult circumstances. The Sonoran Desert during the Apache campaigns, the alkali flats of Nevada in pursuit of Confederate gold shipments, the salt wastes of Utah when winter storms trapped his unit for 3 weeks with minimal supplies. Those experiences lived in his bones, ready to surface when survival demanded them. The trail led through a narrow canyon where red sandstone walls rose like cathedral spires toward a cloudless sky. Jacob moved carefully through the confined space, aware that it would be perfect for an ambush. The gang might have posted a rear guard or simply rigged rockfalls to discourage pursuit. His eyes searched constantly for signs of disturbance, loose stones balanced precariously, scratches in the rock that might indicate climbing, places where a man could hide and wait. Halfway through the canyon, Jacob found what he was looking for and what he'd been dreading, a Blackwood gang campsite. But this one was different from the previous night's temporary stop. This showed signs of longer occupation, more scattered debris, multiple firings, and areas where horses had been picketed for extended periods. Most telling was a crude shelter built against the canyon wall, constructed from scavenged materials and positioned to provide protection from sun and wind. Jacob approached the site with weapons ready, though his instincts told him it was empty. The gang had used this place recently, but not within the last day. Dust patterns and the condition of scattered equipment suggested they'd departed sometime the previous morning, probably shortly after taking Sarah from his cabin. Near the shelter, Jacob made a discovery that stopped him cold. A wooden compass lay partially buried in the sand, its brass case cracked and its needle stuck, pointing toward magnetic north. Jacob recognized it immediately, a compass he'd given Sarah for her 8th birthday, teaching her the basics of navigation during their woodland walks. But this compass told a more complex story than simple abandonment. The crack in the case was fresh, and the way it lay suggested it had been thrown rather than dropped. More importantly, someone had scratched marks into the sand around it, small symbols that looked random but carried meaning for anyone who knew how to read them. Jacob knelt beside the compass and studied the scratches with growing amazement. Sarah had used a technique he'd taught her for marking game trails, a system of lines and dots that indicated direction, distance, and conditions ahead. Reading the marks like a desperate prayer, Jacob deciphered his daughter's message. Southeast, 2 days' ride, water scarce, 5 men still with her. The broken compass told its own story. Sarah had damaged it deliberately, making it useless for navigation, but creating an excuse to mark their position for anyone who might follow. The 8-year-old girl was not only surviving her captivity, but actively working to aid her own rescue. Jacob picked up the compass pieces with hands that trembled slightly. The artifact represented so much: his love for his daughter, her quick intelligence, and the bond between them that transcended the miles of hostile terrain that separated them. He wrapped the broken compass carefully and tucked it into his pack, next to the fragment of her torn nightgown. Following the trail from the canyon campsite required all of Jacob's tracking skills. The gang had made an effort here to obscure their passage, using rocky ground to minimize hoofprints and brushing out obvious signs with broken tree branches. But they couldn't eliminate every trace: a bent piece of sage-grass here, a scratch on a boulder there. The subtle signs that revealed direction and timing to eyes that knew how to read them. The afternoon brought Jacob to the edge of the true desert. Behind him lay the familiar world of mountains and forests. Ahead stretched an alien landscape of sand, scattered rocks, and sparse vegetation, clinging to life in impossible conditions. The gang's trail continued straight into this wasteland, as clear as a signature written in earth and stone. Jacob paused at the transition point, studying the terrain ahead and making calculations that would determine whether he lived or died in the coming days. Water would be the critical factor: finding it, conserving it, and knowing when to risk everything on sources that might prove to be mirages or poisoned alkaline pools. His survival journal contained notes about desert travel, accumulated during campaigns in the southwest when younger men had died from heat stroke, dehydration, and simple mistakes in judgment. Jacob reviewed those pages now, refreshing his memory about techniques for finding water, signs of dangerous weather, and the subtle indicators that separated temporary discomfort from mortal peril. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Jacob made the commitment to follow the trail into the desert. There was no real choice. Sarah was somewhere ahead, probably suffering in heat she'd never experienced, depending on his ability to find her before the harsh environment claimed them both. Jacob filled his water skins at a small seep near the desert's edge, knowing it might be the last reliable source for many miles. He also gathered additional supplies the hostile landscape offered: barrel cactus fruit for emergency water, strips of inner bark from a cottonwood tree for emergency food, and several smooth stones that could be used as tools or weapons if circumstances required. As evening approached, Jacob found himself following the gang's trail across terrain that seemed designed to discourage human passage. The sand was loose and difficult to walk through, the scattered rocks were sharp enough to cut leather, and the few plants showed thorns instead of welcome. This was country that tested every aspect of survival knowledge, but Jacob had advantages the gang probably didn't realize he possessed. His experience included not just military campaigns, but also time spent with Native American guides who'd shared techniques passed down through generations of desert survival. He knew how to read wind patterns for signs of distant water, how to find shade in apparently shadowless landscape, and how to move efficiently across terrain that exhausted inexperienced travelers. More importantly, Jacob was traveling light and alone, while the gang had to manage horses' equipment and a kidnapped child who might require special care. Their advantages in numbers and weapons were offset by logistical challenges that would slow their progress and force them to seek water more frequently than a single determined man. As darkness fell across the desert, Jacob made his own camp in the shelter of a rock formation that provided protection from wind and concealment from anyone who might be watching his back trail. He allowed himself a small fire for warmth and coffee, confident that the smoke would dissipate quickly in the dry air. While he waited for his coffee to brew, Jacob studied the broken compass by firelight, tracing the scratches Sarah had made in the sand with his finger. His daughter was proving to be remarkably resourceful, showing courage and intelligence that would have impressed trained soldiers. The knowledge filled him with fierce pride, but also with deeper worry about what she might be enduring. Jacob's coffee was bitter and strong, flavored with alkali dust and the metallic taste of desert air. As he sipped it, he considered what lay ahead. The gang was 2 days ahead, but traveling with burdens that would slow them down. Sarah's messages suggested they weren't mistreating her badly enough to prevent her from thinking clearly, which meant she was probably being kept as valuable cargo rather than suffering active abuse. The thought provided cold comfort. Even well-treated captives could die in desert conditions, and 8-year-old children had limited tolerance for heat, thirst, and the psychological stress of uncertainty. Jacob needed to close the distance quickly, while conserving enough strength to be effective when he finally caught up with them. As he settled into his blanket for a few hours of rest, Jacob allowed himself to think about Sarah's courage. She was handling her situation with a maturity that both impressed and saddened him. No child should have to develop such survival skills under such circumstances. But the frontier had a way of forcing growth on those who wanted to live through its challenges. The desert night brought cold that seemed to leach warmth from his bones, despite the day's brutal heat. Jacob wrapped himself tightly and tried to find sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new tests of endurance and determination. Somewhere ahead in this vast wasteland, his daughter waited for rescue that might never come. But Jacob McCallister had never failed to complete a mission once he'd committed to it. And Sarah's life was the most important mission he'd ever undertaken. The broken compass in his pack was proof that she believed he would find her, and that faith was worth more than any weapon or survival tool he carried. The hunt would continue at first light. The desert dawn came without mercy, transforming the landscape from freezing darkness to blazing furnace in what seemed like minutes. Jacob woke before sunrise, his body's internal clock calibrated by decades of early rising and the urgent need to make progress while temperatures remained bearable. The sand around his small camp showed the delicate tracks of creatures that had emerged during the night. Sidewinder rattlesnakes, kangaroo rats, and kit foxes adapted to this harsh environment in ways that humans could only admire and attempt to emulate. Jacob's water situation had become critical. His skins held perhaps 2 days' supply if he rationed carefully, and the Blackwood gang's trail showed no sign of veering toward known water sources. They were either following a route they knew well, or they were as desperate as he was and hoping to find salvation ahead, rather than turning back toward certainty. Behind, the trail led across a flat expanse of hardpan desert where the earth had been baked into pottery hard. Plates separated by deep cracks that could turn an ankle or break a horse's leg. Jacob moved carefully across this treacherous surface, reading the story written in disturbed dust and scattered pebbles. The gang's horses were showing signs of stress. Their gaits had become irregular, and several animals were favoring hooves that had been bruised by the unforgiving ground. More encouraging was evidence that the gang was slowing down. Jacob found places where they'd stopped more frequently, probably to rest horses that were approaching exhaustion. The mathematics of pursuit were shifting in his favor, but only if he could maintain his own pace without succumbing to the desert's relentless assault on human endurance. Around midday, when the sun had turned the air itself into a weapon, Jacob found shelter in the shadow of a massive boulder and forced himself to rest during the worst heat. This was desert survival strategy: travel during dawn and dusk, shelter during the day's peak, and never waste energy fighting conditions that couldn't be defeated through determination alone. While he waited for the sun to become bearable again, Jacob studied his survival journal section on desert water sources. Springs were rare but possible, usually marked by green vegetation visible from great distances. More likely were hidden seeps where water collected in rock crevices, or temporary pools created by rare rainstorms. The key was knowing how to read landscape features that revealed the presence of water to trained eyes. Jacob's attention was caught by a distant smudge on the horizon, something that didn't belong to the natural patterns of rock and sand. Through his telescope, he could make out what appeared to be vegetation, possibly even trees, suggesting a water source substantial enough to support plant life. The mirage effects common to desert air made accurate distance estimation impossible. But Jacob judged the green patch to be at least 10 miles away. The gang's trail headed in that general direction, confirming Jacob's suspicion that they knew about the water source and were racing to reach it before their horses collapsed from dehydration. This knowledge gave Jacob his first real tactical advantage since beginning the pursuit. If he could reach the water source first, or even arrive while the gang was still there, he might finally have an opportunity to attempt Sarah's rescue. Jacob spent the afternoon hours planning his approach. The desert's flat expanse offered no concealment for a direct advance, but the same conditions that made hiding impossible also made ambush unlikely. If Jacob could close the distance during the cool evening hours, he might be able to scout the water source and assess the situation without exposing himself to immediate danger. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Jacob resumed his pursuit with renewed energy. The gang's trail was easier to follow now. The horses were tired enough that their riders weren't bothering to obscure hoofprints, and the direct line toward the distant water source made their route predictable. Jacob found himself gaining ground steadily, though he remained several hours behind his quarry. The landscape began changing as Jacob approached the water source. Scattered patches of grass appeared, then hardy shrubs, and finally genuine trees that seemed impossible in this desolate environment. The water here wasn't just a temporary pool, but a permanent oasis fed by an underground spring that had sustained life for thousands of years. Jacob's spirits rose as he drew closer to the green haven ahead. For the first time since beginning his pursuit, he allowed himself to believe that he might actually succeed in rescuing Sarah. The gang would have to stop here for an extended rest. Their horses needed recovery time, and they would want to refill their water supplies before continuing into whatever lay beyond this oasis. But Jacob's optimism was tempered by practical concerns. An oasis that could sustain plant life would be known to other desert travelers, possibly including hostile groups that viewed any water source as territory worth defending. The Blackwood gang might not be the only dangerous element he'd have to deal with. As evening approached, Jacob could see the oasis clearly, a cluster of cottonwood trees surrounding a small lake fed by springs that bubbled up from underground sources. The water appeared clean and abundant, a treasure beyond price in this harsh environment. More importantly, he could see smoke rising from among the trees, indicating that someone had made camp near the water. Jacob approached the oasis with extreme caution, using scattered boulders and sparse vegetation as cover. His military training reasserted itself as he moved, staying low, avoiding sudden movements, keeping the wind direction in mind so that sound wouldn't carry to alert potential enemies. These were skills learned in circumstances where mistakes meant death. Polished by necessity and fear, from a ridge overlooking the oasis, Jacob could see the Blackwood gang's camp clearly through his telescope. The 6 horses were picketed near the water, their heads hanging with exhaustion, but their condition improved by access to unlimited water and the scattered grass around the spring. The men had constructed a more elaborate shelter than their previous camps, using cut branches and blankets to create protection from sun and wind. Most importantly, Jacob could see Sarah. His daughter sat in the shade of the largest cottonwood, her back against the trunk and her legs drawn up to her chest in a posture that spoke of weariness and worry. She appeared unharmed but subdued, lacking the natural animation that had always characterized her personality. The sight filled Jacob with rage and relief in equal measure. Sarah was alive and apparently uninjured, but she was clearly suffering from the psychological strain of captivity. One of the gang members sat near Sarah, apparently assigned as her guard. The man's relaxed posture suggested he wasn't expecting trouble, probably assuming that no pursuit could have survived the desert crossing. The other gang members were scattered around the camp, some tending to equipment and others simply resting in whatever shade they could find. Jacob studied the scene for over an hour, noting positions, weapons, and routines. The gang had grown complacent in their assumed safety, but they weren't careless. Weapons remained within easy reach, and someone was always positioned where they could watch both approaches to the oasis and the area where Sarah sat. As darkness fell, Jacob crept closer to the oasis perimeter. The abundant vegetation provided better cover than he'd enjoyed since leaving the mountains, and the sound of moving water helped mask small noises. He was able to work his way to within 50 yards of the camp before the risk of detection became too great. From his hidden position, Jacob could hear conversation around the gang's campfire. The bearded leader, Marcus Blackwood himself, if Jacob's identification was correct, was discussing their route ahead with casual authority. They planned to remain at the oasis for 2 days, allowing their horses to recover completely before attempting the next stage of their journey. "The old man's probably buzzard food by now," one of the gang members said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Nobody follows a trail into this country and lives to tell about it." "Don't underestimate Jacob McCallister," Blackwood replied quietly. "I've been hunting that man for 15 years, and he survived things that would kill ordinary men. If anyone could cross this desert alive, it would be him. So what if he makes it this far?" Another voice asked. 6 against 1, and we've got his precious daughter." "He'd have to be crazy to try anything." Blackwood's laughter held no warmth. "Crazy is exactly what he'll be by the time he gets here. A man chasing his kidnapped child across impossible country, probably half dead from heat and thirst, consumed by rage and desperation. That's when he'll make mistakes." Jacob listened to this conversation with growing understanding. Blackwood wasn't just trying to escape with Sarah. He was deliberately drawing Jacob into a trap. The gang leader wanted him to follow, wanted him to arrive exhausted and desperate, wanted him to attempt a hopeless rescue that would provide Blackwood with the revenge he'd been seeking for 15 years. But Jacob had one advantage Blackwood couldn't know about. Hidden among the rocks above the oasis, Jacob had found something that could change everything, a small pink hair ribbon, carefully tied to a thorny branch where it would be visible to anyone approaching from the desert, but hidden from casual observation within the camp. Sarah had left him another message, and this one was different from her previous markers. The ribbon's position and the way it was tied suggested urgency, perhaps even immediate danger. Jacob's heart hammered as he considered what his daughter might be trying to tell him. Was she warning him away from a trap, or signaling that time was running out for reasons he didn't yet understand? Jacob settled into his hidden position to watch and wait, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether his 40-day pursuit ended in reunion or tragedy. Sarah's hair ribbon fluttered in the night breeze like a prayer made visible, a reminder that his daughter's life depended on choices he was about to make. The oasis had become a stage where past and present would collide, where a father's love would be tested against a bitter enemy's thirst for revenge. Jacob checked his weapons one final time and prepared to discover what Sarah's final message really meant. Jacob spent the long desert night studying every detail of the Blackwood gang's camp, memorizing guard rotations, weapon positions, and the subtle rhythms of men who believed themselves safe from pursuit. The oasis provided enough ambient light from stars reflecting on water that he could observe without exposing himself, and the constant murmur of the spring masked small movements as he adjusted his position to maintain surveillance. Around midnight, Jacob made a disturbing discovery. While searching through abandoned gear near the camp's perimeter, he found a leather saddlebag that had been carelessly discarded among some rocks. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a daguerreotype photograph of a woman and small child, strangers to Jacob. But the image was treated with the careful reverence that suggested deep personal significance. The photograph was old, probably taken 15 or 20 years earlier, showing a young woman in a simple dress holding a toddler on her lap. Both subjects had the serious expressions common to early photography, but there was warmth in their eyes and in the way the woman's hand rested protectively on the child's shoulder. Someone had written on the back in fading ink, "My beloved Mary and little Thomas, 1863. Jacob stared at the photograph with growing confusion. The woman bore a striking resemblance to his late wife, The same auburn hair, similar facial structure, even a comparable gentle expression around the eyes. The resemblance was so strong that for a moment Jacob wondered if his grief and exhaustion were causing him to see things that weren't there. But the photograph was real, and its presence in Blackwood's possessions suggested connections that Jacob couldn't yet understand. Who were these people, and why would a ruthless outlaw carry their image with such obvious care? The date indicated the photograph was taken during the height of the Civil War, when Jacob had been fighting battles that left scars still visible in his memories and dreams. Jacob tucked the photograph into his pack alongside Sarah's broken compass and torn dress fragment. The image might prove important later, but for now, it represented just another mystery in a situation already complicated beyond his understanding. His priority had to remain focused on Sarah's rescue, regardless of whatever larger games were being played around them. Dawn brought renewed activity in the gang's camp. Jacob watched through his telescope as the men went through morning routines, checking weapons, tending horses, and preparing the kind of substantial breakfast that suggested they felt secure in their temporary sanctuary. Sarah was allowed to move around the camp under guard, and Jacob was relieved to see that she appeared to be walking normally and showing no obvious signs of injury or illness. What concerned Jacob more was his daughter's behavior. Sarah moved through her morning routine with mechanical compliance, lacking the natural curiosity and energy that had always defined her personality. She ate when food was offered, responded when spoken to, but showed none of the spark that made her uniquely herself. The psychological effects of prolonged captivity were taking their toll on a child who'd never experienced genuine fear before this. Nightmare began. Jacob forced himself to remain, hidden as every paternal instinct, screamed at him to rush into the camp and gather Sarah into his arms. But tactical assessment told him that a direct assault would likely result in both their deaths. 6 armed men in a defensible position held overwhelming advantages over a single attacker, regardless of his skills or determination. Instead, Jacob spent the morning conducting detailed reconnaissance of the oasis and surrounding terrain. The water source was fed by multiple springs that created a network of small streams flowing between the trees before collecting in the central pool. This geography created several possible approach routes, though all would require crossing open ground at some point. More promising was Jacob's discovery that the oasis had been used as a camping spot by many previous travelers. Old fire rings, carved initials on tree trunks, and scattered debris indicated regular visitation by people moving through this harsh country. Most importantly, Jacob found evidence of recent use by someone other than the Blackwood gang. Horse droppings that were older than the gang's, arrival but fresher than the other signs of habitation. This suggested that other travelers might appear at the oasis, potentially creating confusion that Jacob could exploit. Desert travelers followed predictable patterns, arriving at water sources exhausted and focused on immediate needs rather than careful observation of their surroundings. If Jacob could time his approach to coincide with such an arrival, he might be able to create enough distraction to attempt Sarah's rescue. As the day progressed, Jacob observed the gang settling into routines that suggested they indeed planned to remain at the oasis for an extended period. Equipment was unpacked and arranged for long-term comfort rather than quick departure. Weapons were cleaned and maintained with the thoroughness of professional fighters preparing for future action. Most telling, several gang members began scouting the area around the oasis, presumably looking for the best defensive positions should they need to fight off pursuit. These preparations confirmed Jacob's suspicion that the gang was deliberately trying to lure him into a confrontation on ground of their choosing. Blackwood wanted Jacob to arrive exhausted and desperate, to attempt a hopeless rescue that would provide the revenge the outlaw leader had been seeking for 15 years. The oasis wasn't just a resting place. It was a carefully chosen killing ground, but Jacob had survived situations like this before, during a war that had taught him the difference between courage and suicide. The key to defeating superior numbers was patience, preparation, and the willingness to wait for circumstances to shift in his favor. Direct confrontation was exactly what his enemies expected, which meant it was the one approach he absolutely couldn't use. Late in the afternoon, Jacob's patience was rewarded. Dust clouds on the horizon indicated approaching riders. At least 3, possibly 4 people moving toward the oasis at the steady pace of travelers who knew their destination and were confident of their welcome. Jacob watched through his telescope as the Blackwood gang noticed the same dust clouds and began making preparations to greet the newcomers. The approaching riders turned out to be a small family group, a man, woman, and 2 teenage children leading pack animals loaded with trade goods. They had the weathered appearance of people who made their living moving merchandise between isolated settlements. Experienced desert travelers who knew how to survive in hostile country but probably had limited combat experience. Jacob watched with growing tension as the trading family approached the oasis. They called out friendly greetings to the Blackwood gang, clearly assuming they were encountering fellow travelers rather than dangerous criminals. The gang responded with apparent hospitality, inviting the newcomers to share the water and make camp for the night. But Jacob could see what the traders couldn't, the subtle positioning of gang members around the camp, the way weapons were kept within easy reach, and the calculating expressions on faces that were supposed to show welcome. The Blackwood gang was preparing to rob and possibly kill these innocent people, probably after dark, when resistance would be more difficult. This created a moral dilemma that Jacob hadn't anticipated. He could remain hidden and focused on Sarah's rescue, allowing the trading family to be victimized but preserving his own tactical advantages. Or he could intervene to protect the innocent traders, almost certainly compromising his position and reducing his chances of saving his daughter. Jacob studied the situation through his telescope, noting positions and possibilities. The traders had set up their own small camp at the opposite end of the oasis from the gang's main position, probably hoping to maintain some privacy despite sharing the water source. Their horses were picketed between the 2 camps, and their trade goods were stacked in plain sight, an obvious temptation to men who took what they wanted through force. Sarah remained under guard near the gang's main shelter, but Jacob noticed that her attention seemed focused on the new arrivals. His daughter was studying the trading family with the same careful observation she'd once applied to wildlife during their woodland walks. Sarah was planning something, though Jacob couldn't guess what a captive 8-year-old might hope to accomplish. As evening approached, both camps prepared for night in their different ways. The trading family shared a simple meal and settled into comfortable routines that spoke of many nights spent camping in dangerous country. The Blackwood gang maintained their appearance of casual friendship while making subtle preparations that Jacob recognized as preliminary to violence. Jacob faced a decision that would determine not only Sarah's fate, but also the lives of 4 innocent people who'd had the misfortune to arrive at the wrong place at the wrong time. Every tactical manual he'd ever studied recommended against dividing his focus between multiple objectives. But Jacob found himself unable to abandon the trading family to certain death. The solution came to him as he watched the sun sink toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of red and gold that reminded him of blood and fire. Instead of choosing between Sarah's rescue and the traders' protection, he would use the coming violence to create the chaos he needed for both objectives. Jacob began moving into position as darkness fell over the oasis. His plan was desperate, dependent on timing and luck in equal measure, but it offered the only possibility he could see for saving both his daughter and the innocent family who'd wandered into Blackwood's trap. The old photograph in his pack seemed to burn against his ribs as Jacob prepared for a confrontation that would either end his long pursuit or transform him back into the kind of man he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, Sarah waited for rescue that might cost everyone their lives. But Jacob McCallister had never walked away from a fight when innocent people needed protection, and he wasn't going to start now, even if it meant sacrificing his best chance of saving his own daughter. The attack came at midnight, just as Jacob had predicted. He watched from his concealed position as 3 members of the Blackwood gang crept toward the traders' camp with weapons drawn, moving with the practiced stealth of men who'd done this many times before. The family slept peacefully around their small fire, unaware that death was approaching on silent feet through the darkness. Jacob had positioned himself between the 2 camps, ready to intervene when the violence began. His plan was simple but desperate. Use the confusion of the attack to create enough chaos that he could reach Sarah while the gang was distracted. It wasn't much of a strategy, but it was better than watching innocent people die while he waited for a perfect opportunity that might never come. The lead attacker was within 10 feet of the sleeping traders when Jacob made his move. A carefully thrown rock struck the man in the head, dropping him unconscious to the sand. The second attacker spun toward the sound, giving Jacob the opening he needed to close distance and strike with the butt of his rifle. The third man managed to shout a warning before Jacob's knife found his throat, but the damage was already done. The trading family came awake to chaos, shouts from the gang's main camp, gunfire splitting the night air, and the sound of running feet on loose sand. Jacob had hoped for confusion, but what he got was a full-scale battle as the gang responded to his intervention with professional violence. "Stay down," Jacob shouted to the traders as bullets began flying overhead. "Keep your heads low and don't move until the shooting stops." Jacob sprinted toward the gang's main camp, using whatever cover the sparse vegetation provided while bullets whined past his head like angry insects. His own rifle spoke twice, dropping 1 gang member and sending another diving for shelter behind a stack of equipment. But there were still too many enemies, and he was caught in the open with nowhere to run. That's when Sarah surprised everyone. Jacob's daughter had somehow freed herself from her bonds and was now running through the chaos with the desperate speed that only terror could provide. But instead of fleeing toward the desert, she was running toward the gang's horses, shouting something Jacob couldn't understand over the gunfire. "Sarah, no!" Jacob yelled, changing direction to intercept her before she could be caught in the crossfire. "Get to cover!" But Sarah wasn't trying to escape. She was trying to reach something specific among the gang's supplies. Jacob watched in amazement as his 8-year-old daughter dove behind a pile of saddlebags and emerged clutching a leather portfolio that she held against her chest like a shield. "Papa!" Sarah called out, her voice clear, despite the violence surrounding them. "I found Mama's letters." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. Mary's letters? What could Sarah possibly mean? His wife had died 3 years ago, and any correspondence she might have had was buried with her personal effects back at their mountain cabin. But there was no time to puzzle over Sarah's words. Marcus Blackwood himself had appeared at the edge of the firelight, a pistol in each hand and murder in his eyes. The outlaw leader moved with the fluid grace of a professional gunfighter, advancing on Jacob's position while his remaining men provided covering fire. "Jacob McCallister!" Blackwood called out over the noise of battle. "Finally decided to join the party, did you? Took you long enough to grow the backbone for a real fight." Jacob fired at Blackwood and missed, his shot going wide as he was forced to duck incoming bullets from multiple directions. The mathematics of the situation were impossible. Too many enemies, too little cover, and Sarah was still exposed near the gang's supplies with nowhere to run. "Give up, McCallister," Blackwood shouted. "Throw down your weapons and maybe the girl lives through this." "Never," Jacob replied, working his way closer to Sarah's position while keeping as much cover as possible between himself and the gang's guns. "Let her go and I'll surrender." Blackwood's laughter was harsh and bitter. "Surrender? After 15 years of hunting you, you think I'd settle for simple surrender? I want you to suffer the way I've suffered. I want you to know what it feels like to lose everything you love. The personal hatred in Blackwood's voice confirmed what Jacob had suspected. This wasn't just about money or random violence. The outlaw leader had some deep grievance against him, something rooted in events Jacob couldn't remember clearly. But the Civil War had been full of hard decisions and tragic consequences, and Jacob had made his share of choices that haunted his dreams. Jacob reached Sarah's position and pulled her into the dubious shelter of an overturned wagon. His daughter clung to the leather portfolio with desperate intensity, her eyes wide with excitement despite the bullets flying overhead. "Papa, you have to see this," Sarah whispered urgently. "Mama's letters are all here, and they say things I don't understand. She knew this man before she married you." Jacob took the portfolio with shaking hands, his mind reeling from this impossible revelation. Inside were dozens of letters, written in Mary's familiar handwriting, addressed to someone named Marcus and signed with endearments that made Jacob's blood run cold. The dates on the letters went back years before Jacob had met his wife, but some were more recent, much more recent. The most recent letter was dated just weeks before Mary's death. Jacob read it by the flickering light of the burning camp, his heart breaking with every word. "My dearest Marcus, I cannot continue this deception much longer." Jacob suspects nothing, but Sarah grows more curious about her true parentage with each passing day. "She has your eyes, your stubborn spirit, and I fear that someday she will ask questions I cannot answer. If something happens to me, promise me you will care for her as your own daughter. She is innocent of the choices we made, and she deserves better than to pay for our mistakes." Jacob stared at the letter until the words blurred, unable to process what he was reading. Mary had been in communication with Marcus Blackwood throughout their marriage. Sarah might not be his biological daughter. The woman he'd loved and trusted had been living a lie that encompassed their entire life together. "Papa." Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" "You look sick." Jacob folded the letter carefully and looked at his daughter, possibly not his daughter, with eyes that saw her clearly for the first time. Sarah did have unusual eyes, a deep brown that neither Jacob nor Mary possessed. Her stubborn independence, her fearless curiosity, her ability to remain calm under pressure. All traits that Jacob had attributed to good parenting, but that might actually be inherited from a man he'd spent weeks hunting across impossible terrain. "Sarah," Jacob said quietly, "do you understand what these letters mean?" His daughter nodded solemnly. "The bad man thinks he's my real papa, but you're the one who taught me everything, who took care of me when Mama died, who came to find me when I got taken. That makes you my real papa, doesn't it?" The simple wisdom of those words cut through Jacob's shock and pain like a clean blade. Sarah was right. Parenthood was about love and dedication, not just biology. He'd been her father in every way that mattered for 8 years, and no revelation from the past could change that bond. But the knowledge did explain Marcus Blackwood's behavior, his willingness to cross deadly terrain with a kidnapped child, and his determination to make Jacob suffer. The outlaw leader believed Sarah was his daughter, taken from him by a man who'd stolen both his woman and his child. In Blackwood's mind, this wasn't kidnapping. It was reclaiming what belonged to him. The gunfire had stopped while Jacob wrestled with his personal revelation. Now voices could be heard approaching through the darkness. Blackwood and his surviving men, probably moving to finish what the battle had started. Jacob checked his weapons and prepared for what might be their final confrontation. "Papa," Sarah whispered, pressing something into his hand. "I found this with Mama's letters. I think it's important." Jacob looked down to see a small silver locket that he'd never seen before. Inside was a miniature photograph of Sarah as a baby, and opposite it, a picture of Marcus Blackwood as a much younger man. The resemblance between father and daughter was unmistakable once Jacob knew what to look for. The locket was more than just a keepsake. It was proof of Sarah's parentage and evidence of Mary's secret relationship with the outlaw leader. But it was also something else, a symbol of the complex web of love, loss, and loyalty that had brought them all to this deadly confrontation in a desert oasis. Jacob closed the locket and tucked it into his shirt pocket next to his heart. Whatever biological connections existed between Sarah and Marcus Blackwood, Jacob knew with absolute certainty that he would die before allowing anyone to take his daughter away from him. The truth about Sarah's parentage changed nothing about his love for her, but it did help him understand the forces that had shaped this confrontation. "Stay close to me," Jacob told Sarah as footsteps approached their position. "Whatever happens next, remember that you are my daughter in every way that matters, and I love you more than life itself." Sarah nodded and gripped his hand tightly. Together, they waited for Marcus Blackwood to emerge from the darkness, knowing that the final confrontation would determine not just their survival, but the very definition of what made a family in the unforgiving wilderness of the American frontier. Marcus Blackwood emerged from the shadows like a spectre materialized from Jacob's worst memories. The outlaw leader had discarded his long coat during the fighting, revealing a lean frame marked by old scars and the kind of weathered toughness that came from decades of hard living. His dark eyes swept the scene of destruction, 3 of his men dead, the trading family cowering behind their overturned wagon, and Jacob crouched protectively over a child who might be Blackwood's own flesh and blood. "Quite a mess you've made of my camp, McCallister," Blackwood said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than standing amid the aftermath of a deadly gunfight. "Though I have to admit, it's about what I expected from the famous Ghost of Chancellorsville." Jacob kept his rifle trained on Blackwood while using his body to shield Sarah. The outlaw leader made no aggressive moves, but his remaining men were positioned where they could cover multiple angles if the confrontation turned violent again. The tactical situation remained impossible. Jacob might be able to kill Blackwood, but Sarah would almost certainly die in the resulting crossfire. "You got what you wanted," Jacob said quietly. "I'm here. Let the girl go and settle this between us." Blackwood's smile was sharp as a knife blade. "Let her go? You still don't understand, do you? That's not just any girl you're protecting so fiercely. That's my daughter you've been raising as your own for the past 8 years. "I know about the letters," Jacob replied. "I know about Mary's relationship with you. It doesn't change anything, doesn't it?" Blackwood took a step closer, his hands held away from his weapons, but his posture radiating dangerous energy. "Doesn't change the fact that you built your perfect little life on a foundation of lies? Doesn't change the fact that every moment of happiness you've experienced was stolen from me?" Jacob felt Sarah's small hand grip his sleeve more tightly, but his daughter remained silent and still. The 8-year-old girl was showing remarkable composure for someone caught between 2 men who both claimed to be her father, but Jacob could feel the tension in her small body. "Mary chose her own path," Jacob said carefully. "Whatever relationship you two had was over before I met her. She chose to marry me, chose to build a life in the mountains, chose to be happy. You don't get to blame me for her choices." Blackwood's laugh held no warmth. "Chose? You think she chose anything?" "She was running, McCallister. Running from the consequences of loving the wrong man, carrying the child of someone the law wanted dead or alive. You were just convenient, a respectable solution to an impossible problem." The words hit Jacob like physical blows, confirming fears he'd carried for years without quite acknowledging them. Mary had always been slightly mysterious about her past, vague about family connections, reluctant to discuss the years before they'd met. Jacob had attributed this to natural reserve, but now he wondered if he'd been willfully blind to obvious deceptions. "Even if that's true," Jacob said, "it doesn't give you the right to terrorize a child. Sarah has done nothing wrong." "Sarah." Blackwood spoke his daughter's name like a prayer. "Mary named her after my mother. Did she tell you that when she suggested the name? Or did you just accept another lie in a marriage built on deception?" Jacob hadn't known about the name's significance, and the revelation stung more than he wanted to admit. How many other details of his life with Mary had been calculated deceptions rather than genuine expressions of love? The foundation of his identity as a husband and father was crumbling beneath the weight of these revelations. But Sarah's voice cut through his doubts like sunlight through storm clouds. "My Mama loved Papa Jacob," she said firmly, stepping out from behind his protective stance to face Blackwood directly. "I remember how she looked at him, how she smiled when he came home from hunting, how she cried when she thought he wasn't looking because she was scared of leaving us alone." Blackwood stared at his biological daughter with an expression that mixed longing, pain, and desperate hope. "Sarah, you don't understand. I'm your real father, your blood father. I loved your mother before she ever met this man." "I know," Sarah replied, with the devastating honesty that only children possessed. "I read some of the letters. But Papa Jacob is the one who taught me to track animals and read weather signs. He's the one who held me when I had nightmares after Mama died. He's the one who came across the desert to find me when bad men took me away. That's what real fathers do." Jacob felt his heart breaking and mending simultaneously. Sarah understood the situation better than either of the adults who were fighting over her, and her wisdom humbled him. She'd chosen him not out of ignorance, but out of love. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Blackwood's face contorted with emotion, rage, grief, and frustrated paternal love warring for dominance. "You've turned her against me," he said to Jacob, his voice thick with accusation. "Poisoned her mind against her own blood." "I've loved her," Jacob replied simply. "Every day for 8 years, I've tried to be the father she deserved. That's all any parent can do." From his shirt pocket, Jacob withdrew his father's Civil War medal, a simple bronze disc worn smooth by decades of handling. The medal had belonged to his grandfather, then his father, and finally to Jacob himself. It represented duty, honor, and the burden of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "This belonged to my father, and his father before him," Jacob said, holding the medal where both Blackwood and Sarah could see it. "It's not about blood or biology. It's about the choice to stand between your family and whatever threatens them, no matter the cost." Sarah looked at the medal with recognition. Jacob had shown it to her before, explaining its history and what it represented about their family's values. Now she understood that he was offering to pass that legacy to her, regardless of whose blood flowed in her veins. Blackwood's remaining men shifted restlessly, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional intensity of the confrontation. These were hard men, accustomed to violence and simple solutions, not complex discussions about parenthood and family bonds. Their leader's obsession with reclaiming his daughter was putting them all at risk for reasons they couldn't fully understand. "Marcus," one of the men said quietly, "maybe we should just take what we came for and move on. The girl's made her choice clear enough." "Shut up," Blackwood snarled without taking his eyes off Sarah. "This isn't about choice. This is about blood, about family, about what was stolen from me 15 years ago." Jacob realized that Blackwood's obsession went deeper than paternal love. The outlaw leader wasn't just trying to reclaim his daughter. He was trying to undo the past, to somehow repair the damage done when Mary had chosen respectability over outlaw love. Sarah had become a symbol of everything Blackwood had lost, and he couldn't accept that she might choose differently than her mother had. "Tell me about Chancellorsville," Jacob said suddenly, changing the subject to something that might break through Blackwood's emotional fixation. "You mentioned it earlier. What happened there that made you hate me so much?" Blackwood's expression shifted, the desperate father momentarily replaced by the bitter veteran. "You really don't remember, do you? Colonel Jacob McCallister of the 3rd Pennsylvania Volunteers, the man who sent 200 boys to die, taking a hill that didn't matter." The memory hit Jacob like cold water. Chancellorsville, 1863. A desperate assault ordered by commanders who didn't understand the tactical situation. Jacob had led the charge personally, knowing it was probably hopeless, but unable to ask men to do what he wouldn't do himself. They'd taken the hill, held it for 6 hours, then been ordered to withdraw anyway. "The casualty list had been devastating, I remember," Jacob said quietly. "You were there?" "I was 19 years old, scared out of my mind, and following orders from an officer who was supposed to know better. I watched my best friend die in the first 5 minutes. Watched boys I'd grown up with get torn apart by canister shot because some colonel decided a useless piece of ground was worth dying for. The pain in Blackwood's voice was genuine and raw. Even after all these years, Jacob understood now that this confrontation was about more than Sarah. It was about survivors' guilt, about the arbitrary nature of who lived and who died in war, about the burden carried by those who made it home when better men didn't. "I've carried those names with me for 25 years, Jacob said. "Every man who died because of my orders. I know that doesn't ease your pain, but their deaths have haunted me every day since that battle." "Pretty words," Blackwood spat. "But words don't bring back the dead. Words don't give me back the years I lost. The woman who ran from me because loving an outlaw was too dangerous. The daughter I never got to raise." Sarah stepped forward again, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood the gravity of the moment. In her small hands, she held something Jacob hadn't noticed before, a simple wooden carving, roughly shaped like a horse. "You made this for me," Sarah said to Blackwood, her voice soft but clear. "It was in with Mama's letters. She kept it all these years because it reminded her of you." Blackwood stared at the crude carving as if seeing a ghost. "I whittled that for you when you were just a baby," he whispered. "Your mother said you liked horses, that you laughed when she made galloping sounds." "I still like horses," Sarah said. "Papa Jacob taught me to ride. He said maybe someday we'd get a pony of our own when we had enough money saved up." The simple domestic detail seemed to break something inside Blackwood. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked less like a dangerous outlaw and more like a broken man mourning opportunities that would never come again. Jacob watched this exchange with growing understanding. Blackwood's hatred wasn't just about the war or even about losing Mary and Sarah. It was about time, the irreplaceable years that had passed while he'd been running from the law, building a reputation as a killer, becoming the kind of man no decent woman could love and no child should know as a father. The truth was that Blackwood had lost his family not because Jacob had stolen them, but because his own choices had made him unfit for the kind of life Mary wanted for herself and her daughter. Jacob had simply been in the right place at the right time to offer what Blackwood could never provide: stability, respectability and safety, but that knowledge didn't make the confrontation any less dangerous. A man who'd built his identity around hatred and revenge couldn't easily let go of those emotions, even when faced with evidence that they were destroying what he claimed to love most. Jacob prepared himself for whatever came next, knowing that the final moments of this confrontation would determine whether Sarah grew up knowing peace or violence, whether she learned that family was about love or about the bitter satisfaction of old grudges finally settled. The desert silence stretched between them like a held breath. 3 armed men faced each other around the dying embers of the campfire, while an 8-year-old girl held the power to determine whether the night ended in reconciliation or bloodshed. The trading family remained hidden behind their overturned wagon, smart enough to stay out of a confrontation that had nothing to do with them, but could easily cost them their lives. Sarah stepped closer to Marcus Blackwood, still holding the wooden horse he'd carved for her as a baby. Her movement was careful and deliberate, showing none of the fear that would have been natural in a child her age. Instead, she studied Blackwood's face with the same intense curiosity she'd always applied to tracking wounded animals or identifying unfamiliar plants. "You're sad," she said finally, her voice carrying the simple directness that only children possessed. "You've been sad for a very long time, haven't you?" Blackwood's composure cracked at the unexpected observation. Yes, I have been sad. Angry too, but mostly sad. Mama was sad sometimes," Sarah continued, "especially when she thought Papa Jacob and I couldn't see her. She used to look out the window toward the desert like she was waiting for someone to come home." Jacob felt a stab of pain at this revelation. He'd noticed Mary's occasional melancholy, but had attributed it to grief for family members lost to disease or violence, the common sorrows of frontier life. Now he realized she'd been mourning a very specific loss, thinking about a man she'd loved but couldn't build a life with. "She was waiting for me," Blackwood said quietly. "Even after all those years, part of her was still waiting for me to become the kind of man she could bring home to her daughter." Sarah nodded, as if this made perfect sense to her. "But you couldn't become that man, could you? Because being an outlaw was easier than being a papa." The words hit Blackwood like a physical blow. Out of the mouths of babes came truths that adults spent lifetimes avoiding. Sarah had identified the core of Blackwood's tragedy. Not that Jacob had stolen his family, but that he'd never been willing to pay the price necessary to keep them. "It wasn't easier," Blackwood said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was all I knew how to be. After the war, after watching so many good men die for causes that didn't matter, I couldn't see the point in trying to build something that could be taken away so easily." Jacob understood this perspective better than he wanted to admit. The same disillusionment had nearly consumed him after Appomattox, when he'd wandered west, looking for something to fill the emptiness left by too much death and too many hard choices. The difference was that Jacob had been lucky enough to meet Mary when she needed someone stable, and he needed someone to care about more than his own pain. But things can't be taken away if you don't fight to keep them, Sarah said, displaying wisdom that seemed impossible in someone so young. "Papa Jacob taught me that. He said the most important battles are the ones you fight every single day, just by choosing to love people, even when it's hard." Blackwood stared at his biological daughter with an expression of wonder and heartbreak. Here was proof that he'd contributed something good to the world, even though he'd never been present to guide or influence her development. Sarah's strength and wisdom came partly from Jacob's teaching, but the bedrock courage that allowed her to face dangerous men without flinching, that was pure Blackwood bloodline. "You're remarkable," Blackwood said to Sarah. "Your mother would be so proud of the person you're becoming." "She was proud," Sarah replied, "but she was also scared. I think she was scared that someday you'd come back and want to take me away from the only life I'd ever known." Jacob felt his grip tighten on his rifle. Here was the moment of truth. Would Blackwood try to claim his daughter by force, or would he find some other way to resolve the situation? The outlaws' remaining men were watching their leader carefully, ready to follow whatever course he chose, but clearly hoping to avoid more violence. Blackwood seemed to wrestle with internal demons that had been tormenting him for decades. His eyes moved between Sarah's trusting face and Jacob's tense posture, between the life he'd lost and the life he might still be able to influence. The choice he made in the next few moments would define not only his relationship with his daughter, but also the kind of man he would be for whatever years remained to him. "Sarah," Blackwood said finally, "I want you to know that I loved your mother very much. Not wisely, not well enough to keep her, but truly and deeply. And I love you too, even though I've never had the chance to show it." Sarah nodded solemnly. "I know, I can see it in your eyes. It's the same way Papa Jacob looks at me when he thinks I'm not paying attention." Jacob felt his heart clench at the comparison. Despite everything, the violence, the deception, the years of separation, Sarah could recognize the common thread of paternal love that connected both men to her. Her ability to see past their anger and fear to the love beneath was humbling. "But love isn't enough, is it?" Blackwood continued. "A real father has to do more than just love his child. He has to protect her, provide for her, teach her how to be strong and good and wise. Jacob has done all of those things. I've done none of them." The admission cost Blackwood visible effort, but it seemed to lift some invisible weight from his shoulders. For the first time since Jacob had met him, the outlaw leader looked like a man who might be capable of peace rather than just violence. Sarah reached into the small satchel she'd been carrying and pulled out something that made both men freeze. It was a makeshift slingshot, constructed from a forked branch and strips of leather cut from her own dress. The workmanship was crude but functional, exactly the kind of improvised weapon Jacob had taught her to make during their survival lessons. I made this while you were all talking, Sarah said matter-of-factly. Papa Jacob taught me how. He said sometimes you have to be ready to protect yourself and the people you love. Jacob stared at the slingshot with a mixture of pride and horror. His daughter had been prepared to fight grown men with nothing but a child's improvised weapon, and the courage he'd tried to instill in her. The realization of how close they'd all come to a tragedy that would have destroyed everyone involved made his hands shake. Blackwood looked at the slingshot and began to laugh, not with mockery, but with genuine appreciation for his daughter's spirit. You were going to fight 6 armed men with a slingshot? If I had to, Sarah replied seriously. Papa Jacob says that sometimes the size of your weapon matters less than the size of your heart. He's right, Blackwood said, his laughter fading into something deeper and more thoughtful. And you have the biggest heart I've ever seen, little girl. That's from your mother, not from me. Jacob realized that the confrontation had reached a turning point. The violence and hatred that had brought them all to this deadly oasis was being transformed by an 8-year-old girl's simple refusal to accept that the adults in her life had to be enemies. Sarah was teaching them all a lesson about forgiveness and family that none of them had expected to learn. But the night wasn't over yet, and Jacob knew that understanding didn't automatically translate to resolution. Blackwood might acknowledge the wisdom of leaving Sarah with the only father she'd ever known, but his men might not be willing to accept such an anticlimactic ending to their long pursuit. And there was still the matter of the crimes Blackwood had committed, the innocent people he'd victimized, and the debt he owed to society for his years as an outlaw. The final test was yet to come. The moment of revelation came when Blackwood reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a heart-shaped silver locket, the mate to the one Sarah had shown Jacob among Mary's possessions. His weathered fingers traced the intricate engraving on its surface as if it were a holy relic, and when he opened it, the soft metallic click seemed to echo across the desert like a gunshot. Inside the locket were 2 tiny photographs. One showed Mary as a young woman, barely more than a girl, smiling with the carefree joy of someone who believed the future held nothing but happiness. The other showed a baby, Sarah, perhaps 6 months old, sleeping peacefully in someone's arms. "This is all I had of either of you for 8 years, Blackwood said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I used to take it out every night and wonder what you looked like, what your voice sounded like, whether you were happy or sad or afraid." Sarah stepped closer and extended her own locket, the one she'd found among her mother's things. When placed side by side, the 2 pieces formed a complete heart, obviously designed to be shared between lovers who were separated by distance or circumstance. "Mama kept the other half," Sarah said softly. "She used to hold it sometimes when she thought nobody was watching, especially when Papa Jacob was away hunting and the cabin felt too quiet." Jacob watched this exchange with emotions too complex to name. Part of him felt jealous of the connection between Mary and Blackwood that had survived years of separation. But a larger part of him felt grateful that Mary had found some way to remember happiness during the dark periods when grief and loneliness threatened to overwhelm her. "She never forgot you," Sarah continued, looking directly at Blackwood. "But she also never regretted choosing to make a life with Papa Jacob. She told me once that sometimes loving someone means wanting them to be safe and happy, even if that means they can't be with you." Blackwood's face contorted with pain and something that might have been relief. "She was always wiser than I was. Even when we were young, she could see consequences I was too stubborn to acknowledge." "Marcus," said one of Blackwood's remaining men, shifting impatiently, "this is all very touching, but we need to make a decision. Dawn's coming, and if there are posses following our trail, we can't afford to stay here much longer." Jacob tensed, recognizing the voice of pragmatism that often ended emotional moments with violence. Blackwood's men had followed him across brutal terrain and through deadly confrontations, and they deserved an answer about whether this reunion would result in the prize they'd been promised, or just more complications. "You're right. Pete," Blackwood said, closing his locket with a decisive snap. Time to make some hard choices. He turned to Jacob, and for a moment the two men simply stared at each other across 8 years of pain, misunderstanding, and shared love for the same remarkable child. Jacob saw something in Blackwood's eyes that he hadn't expected, not defeat or resignation, but a kind of peace that came from finally understanding what needed to be done. "Jacob McCallister," Blackwood said formally, "I've spent 15 years hating you for something that was never your fault. You didn't steal my family. I threw them away through my own choices and cowardice. You gave them the life I was too selfish and too afraid to provide." "Marcus," Jacob began, but Blackwood held up a hand to stop him. "Let me finish. I kidnapped your daughter and put you both through hell because I wanted to punish you for being a better man than I was. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. Sarah belongs with you, not because of blood or law, but because you've earned the right to be her father through 8 years of love and sacrifice." The apology hung in the desert air like something fragile and precious. Jacob felt his anger and fear drain away, replaced by something he hadn't expected to feel toward Marcus Blackwood: understanding, and perhaps even a grudging respect. "What happens now?" Jacob asked quietly. Blackwood looked at his remaining men, then at Sarah, then out toward the eastern horizon, where the first pale hints of dawn were beginning to show. "Now I try to figure out how a man changes the direction of his life when he's been running in the wrong direction for so long." Sarah stepped between the two men and took each by the hand. Her small fingers were warm and strong, and Jacob felt some of the tension leave his body at her touch. "Maybe," Sarah said carefully, "you don't have to run away anymore. Maybe you could try staying in one place and building something instead of just taking things." "It's not that simple, little one," Blackwood replied sadly. "I've done things, bad things, that can't be undone just because I finally understand what's important. There are consequences for the choices I've made." "Like what?" Sarah asked with the directness that had been surprising adults all her life. Blackwood gestured toward his men and the evidence of violence scattered around their camp. "Like the fact that I'm wanted for murder, robbery, and kidnapping in 3 territories. Like the fact that there are probably marshals and bounty hunters following our trail right now. Like the fact that good men are dead because of orders I gave and choices I made." Sarah considered this information with the seriousness she brought to all adult problems that were presented to her honestly. "Papa Jacob says that when you make a mistake, the best thing to do is try to fix it, even if fixing it is harder than making it was." "Some mistakes can't be fixed," Blackwood said gently. "But you can try," Sarah insisted. "You can stop making new mistakes and start trying to help people instead of hurting them." Jacob watched his daughter attempt to redeem a hardened outlaw through simple moral clarity and felt a surge of pride so intense it made his chest ache. Sarah had inherited the best qualities of both her biological and adoptive fathers, but her wisdom and compassion were entirely her own. "She's right," Jacob said to Blackwood. "It's never too late to choose a different path, as long as you're willing to pay the price for changing direction." "And what price would that be?" Blackwood asked, though Jacob suspected he already knew the answer: surrender. "Face trial for your crimes. Accept whatever justice the law decides you deserve. But also prove that you've changed by how you handle whatever comes next." Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, looking at Sarah's face in the growing light of dawn. Jacob could see him weighing possibilities: flight versus justice, freedom versus redemption, the easy path versus the right one. "If I surrender," Blackwood said finally, "what happens to Sarah? I mean, what happens to her relationship with me? Do I disappear from her life forever, or—" The question revealed what was really driving Blackwood's internal struggle. He'd finally found his daughter and discovered that she was everything he could have hoped for. But claiming her would mean destroying the stable life she'd built with Jacob. The choice between his own desires and Sarah's welfare was tearing him apart. Sarah seemed to understand the real question he was asking. "Papa Marcus," she said, using the title naturally, as if she'd been thinking about it for some time, "you'll always be my first father, the one who gave me life. But Papa Jacob will always be my heart father, the one who taught me how to live. I don't think I have to choose between you." The simple wisdom of those words broke through the last of Blackwood's resistance. Jacob watched the outlaw leader's face transform as he realized that love didn't have to be about possession or exclusion. Sarah had room in her heart for both fathers, if they were both willing to put her welfare above their own needs and fears. "You're right," Blackwood said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're absolutely right." He turned to Jacob. "Will you help me do this right? Will you help me figure out how to surrender with some dignity and honor?" Jacob extended his hand to the man who'd been his enemy for 40 days and 15 years. "I'll help," he said simply. As their hands clasped in the growing light of dawn, Jacob felt the weight of old hatred and fear lifting from his shoulders. The hunt was finally over, but something better was just beginning. 3 months later, Jacob sat on the familiar porch of his mountain cabin, watching Sarah practice her letters by the light of a kerosene lamp. The evening air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and the meadow around their home showed the first touches of gold that would soon transform the landscape into something magical and temporary. The cabin felt different now, not smaller or larger, but somehow more complete. On the mantelpiece sat a new photograph, a simple sketch that Sarah had drawn during their long journey home from the desert. It showed 3 figures standing together, a tall man with a rifle, a shorter man with a beard, and a small girl holding both their hands. Underneath, in Sarah's careful handwriting, were the words, "My family." Marcus Blackwood had kept his word. With Jacob and Sarah accompanying him as witnesses to his voluntary surrender, he'd ridden into the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe and confessed to 15 years of crimes. The trial had been swift but fair, and the judge had taken Blackwood's surrender and cooperation into account when determining his sentence. Instead of hanging, he'd received 20 years of hard labor, with the possibility of parole after 10 years if he demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. The trading family they'd rescued at the oasis had testified on Blackwood's behalf, describing how he'd protected them during the journey to Santa Fe and helped them recover the trade goods that had been scattered during the gunfight. It was a small gesture of redemption, but it had made a difference in how the court viewed his case. Jacob pulled out the latest letter from the territorial prison, written in Blackwood's careful handwriting and addressed to Sarah McCallister. The letters came monthly, filled with stories about his work in the prison carpenter shop, his efforts to learn reading and arithmetic from the prison chaplain, and his gradual acceptance of responsibility for the pain he'd caused. Most importantly, the letters never asked Sarah to choose between her fathers or suggested that she should feel guilty about the happiness she'd found with Jacob. Blackwood had embraced his role as Sarah's biological father while fully supporting Jacob's position as her real father in every way that mattered. "Papa," Sarah said, looking up from her writing practice, "will you read Papa Marcus's letter out loud? I like hearing his stories in your voice." Jacob smiled and unfolded the letter carefully. Blackwood's handwriting had improved dramatically during his months in prison, and his vocabulary had expanded as well. The man who'd once expressed himself primarily through violence was learning to use words as tools of connection rather than weapons of intimidation. "My dear Sarah," Jacob read, "I hope this letter finds you and your papa healthy and happy as the seasons change in your beautiful mountains. The prison chaplain has been teaching me about carpentry, and I'm learning to make useful things instead of just breaking them. Last week, I finished a small table that will be donated to a family whose home was damaged by fire. It felt good to build something that would help people instead of hurting them." Sarah smiled at this news. She'd been fascinated by Blackwood's transformation from destroyer to creator, and she often asked Jacob to explain how people could change so completely when they decided to embrace different values. "I've been thinking about the lessons your Papa Jacob taught you," the letter continued, "and I realized that he was preparing you for exactly the kind of situation we all faced in the desert. Not just teaching you survival skills, but teaching you how to see the good in people, even when they've done bad things, how to forgive without forgetting, and how to love without conditions. These are gifts that will serve you well throughout your life. Jacob paused in his reading, moved by Blackwood's recognition of the values that had guided their family. The outlaw was learning to see his daughter's strength not as something that diminished his own importance, but as something that validated the choices both her fathers had made in raising her. The prison chaplain says that redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about choosing to write a different future. I can't undo the harm I caused or bring back the people who died because of my choices. But I can spend whatever years remain to me trying to balance the scales by helping others and being the kind of man you can be proud to call your first father. Sarah reached over and took Jacob's hand, squeezing it gently. "I am proud of him," she said softly. "It takes more courage to change than it does to stay the same." Jacob continued reading. "Your Papa Jacob wrote to tell me about your latest adventures, how you tracked a wounded deer for 3 miles to make sure it wasn't suffering, how you helped Mrs. Patterson find her lost cow, and how you've been teaching the younger children at church about wilderness survival. I'm not surprised that you're using the skills he taught you to help others. That's what real strength is for." The letter went on to describe Blackwood's daily routine, his growing friendship with the prison chaplain, and his plans for life after his eventual release. He wrote about possibly starting a carpentry business in a small town where his past wouldn't define his future, about contributing to his community instead of preying upon it, and about hoping that someday Sarah might want to visit him and see the man he was becoming. "I close this letter as I close all of them," Jacob read, "with love for my remarkable daughter and gratitude for the man who raised her to be everything I hoped she would become, but never had the wisdom or courage to nurture myself. You are both in my thoughts and prayers every day." Jacob folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the wooden box where they kept all of Blackwood's correspondence. Sarah had decorated the box with carved flowers and painted designs, transforming it into something beautiful that honored both the pain of separation and the hope of eventual reconciliation. "Do you think he'll really change?" Sarah asked, voicing the question that had been on both their minds for months. "Do you think people can really become different than they were?" Jacob considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer would influence how Sarah viewed human nature and the possibility of redemption for the rest of her life. "I think people can change if they really want to," he said finally. "But it's hard work, and it takes time, and they have to be willing to accept the consequences of who they used to be while they're becoming who they want to be. Your Papa Marcus is doing that work day by day." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Like how I'm learning to read better by practicing every day, even when it's difficult, and I'd rather be doing something else." "Exactly like that," Jacob agreed. "Except changing who you are as a person is much harder than learning to read, because you have to change your thoughts and feelings and habits, not just your knowledge." As they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, Jacob reflected on how much their lives had changed since that terrible morning when Sarah had been taken from him. The 40-day pursuit had transformed him from a peaceful mountain man back into the kind of warrior he'd tried to leave behind. But it had also taught him that love sometimes required embracing aspects of yourself you'd rather forget. More importantly, the experience had expanded their definition of family in ways Jacob never could have imagined. Sarah now had 2 fathers who loved her, each contributing different strengths to her development. Jacob provided stability, daily guidance, and unconditional acceptance. Blackwood, even from prison, offered perspective on the importance of choosing good over evil and the possibility that people could redeem themselves through sustained effort and genuine remorse. The wooden doll that had started their journey, the simple toy that represented Jacob's love for his daughter, now sat on Sarah's windowsill alongside other artifacts from their adventure. The broken compass had been repaired and returned to working order, symbolizing their ability to find their way home, despite being lost in hostile territory. The fragments of Mary's letters had been carefully preserved, not as evidence of deception, but as proof that love could survive separation and time. Most significantly, Sarah had created her own artifact to commemorate their experience, a detailed drawing that showed their cabin surrounded by all the people who'd touched their lives. Jacob and Sarah stood in the center, but the image also included Mary, drawn from memory and faded photographs. Marcus Blackwood, as he appeared in the desert rather than as a threatening figure, the trading family they'd saved, and even the marshal who'd treated Blackwood with dignity during his surrender. "Papa," Sarah said, interrupting Jacob's reverie, "I've been thinking about what I want to be when I grow up." "Oh? And what's that?" "I want to help people find their way home when they're lost," she said seriously. "Not just lost in the wilderness, but lost in their lives. Like Papa Marcus was lost until he found us again." Jacob felt his heart swell with pride and love. Sarah had transformed the trauma of her kidnapping into a mission of compassion, choosing to see her ordeal as preparation for helping others, rather than as something that had damaged her permanently. "That's a beautiful goal," Jacob said, "and I think you'll be very good at it. You've already had plenty of practice." Sarah smiled and returned to her writing practice, working on a letter she was composing to Marcus Blackwood. Her correspondence with her biological father had become an important part of her education, teaching her about forgiveness, redemption, and the complexity of human nature in ways no schoolbook could match. As Jacob watched his daughter write by lamplight, surrounded by the artifacts and memories of their extraordinary journey, he realized that the hunt for Sarah had ended exactly where it began, with a father and daughter sitting together in the peace of their mountain home, grateful for each other's presence and confident in their love. The difference was that their family had grown larger, their understanding had grown deeper, and their appreciation for the precious gift of ordinary moments had been refined by the knowledge of how quickly everything could be lost. They had learned that family was indeed defined by love rather than blood. But they had also learned that love could encompass more complexity and forgiveness than they'd ever imagined possible. Outside their cabin, the mountain wind whispered through the pine trees with the same gentle voice that had blessed their mornings for years. But now Jacob heard in that sound not just the promise of another peaceful day, but the echo of his own journey from vengeance to understanding, from desperate pursuit to grateful acceptance. The 40 days in the desert had tested every survival skill he possessed. But the true test had been learning that some victories could only be won by choosing mercy over justice, redemption over revenge. In saving Sarah, Jacob had also saved himself from becoming the kind of man his daughter would have been ashamed to call father. As Sarah finished her letter and prepared for bed, she looked up at Jacob with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her 8 years. "Papa," she said quietly, "do you think we'll ever see Papa Marcus again? Outside of prison?" Jacob considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer would shape Sarah's hopes and expectations for years to come. "I think so," he said finally. "Not soon and not in the way any of us might have planned, but yes. I believe we'll see him again when he's ready to be the man you deserve to know." Sarah nodded, satisfied with this measured hope. She kissed Jacob goodnight and disappeared into her small room, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the familiar weight of responsibility that came with being a father. Jacob sat on his porch for a long time that night, looking out over the meadow where Sarah's laughter had been silenced by violence and restored by love. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow comforting in their constancy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons to teach and learn, new opportunities to prove that love was indeed stronger than fear. But tonight, Jacob McCallister was simply a man who had gotten his daughter back, learned that families could be larger and more complicated than he'd ever imagined. and discovered that sometimes the most important journeys led not to new destinations, but back to the place you started with deeper appreciation for what you'd nearly lost. The mountain man's hunt was over. The father's work would continue forever.